that's partly why I invited you on the show, because I really like your work on on social media and everything. And having read Ray Naga a little bit, through various translated various quotes in translation, um, it's something that I'm interested in. But I want to turn a little bit back to this conversation we were having earlier about Evo Morales and
Yeah.
his consciousness. And I think in the Evo hasn't really had a lot of his work translated into English, and we're working on a project right now to
Wonderful.
do some of that. Hopefully, sometime soon, we'll get some information out there. But somebody like Garcia Linera, his vice president, is always kind of thought of. He's a white guy, Bolivian white guy. Is always kind of thought of as like the intellectual muscle of like MAS, movement towards socialism, or the project of that they have underway down there. And Nevo isn't really thought of as kind of an intellectual person, but I've seen him, I met him, and I've listened to him talk, and he is he's a definitely a union organizer for sure,
Yeah.
but he is a very smart person, and his thought, I think, is incredibly important. And I was wondering if you could maybe put him uh, into context in this conversation that we're having about indigenous socialism,
Yeah.
plurinationalism, the rise of the movement towards socialism, and the kind of Bolivian experiment that is currently underway.
Yeah. Before I get into that, I do want to like give out some names for people who are like, oh, there's not much like Andean Marxism that
Yeah.
existed. In Ecuador, you have like Luis Monsalve Pozo, who was a Marxist in Ecuador at the time during the 40s and 50s, and he was associated with Pio Jaramillo and like the Indigenista movement at the time. You have the Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios, the Federation of Ecuadorian Indians, the FEI, which was prominent during the 50s and 60s, which had actually indigenous Marxist women. One of the few movements where they were prominent, like Tránsito Amaguaña, and I can't believe I'm forgetting the her other name. She's if
But
you look at if you look it up though, Tránsito Amaguaña, she's usually paired with another Quechua woman who actually is quite intellectual, though she never wrote any independent books. I think they're mainly interviews. But they speak from from a Quechua perspective in terms of the fight for land. In Peru, you have similar movements like the Confederación Campesina del Perú, or the Peasant Confederation of Peru, the CCP, not the Chinese Communist Party, but like the other CCP, the more famous one, the one from Peru. But they were the major labor organizers, and they were
are you
successors
talking
to
about
not.
the Shining Path?
No, the
Sendero
Shining
movement.
Path. Well, the Shining Path are very controversial, and I personally don't like them. Of the Shining Path, there were ideas where maybe the CCP, the Confederation, or the Peasant Confederation of Peru was working with the Shining Path,
Yeah.
but it's tenuous at best. But yeah, many of those leaders were working since the 20s and 30s, and leaders that were a part of it, like Hugo Blanco, who was he's actually a mestizo farmer in Cusco who actually learned Quechua and deals with and works with indigenous peoples. In some ways, he was indigenized into the community and welcomed in. I forget which community in Cusco, but he's a fluent Quechua speaker. And there's an interesting thing in which many mestizos re-indigenize, and I think that should be important because many mestizos, mixed peoples, are actually indigenous. There's just been a rejection of that indigeneity and the move towards Hispanidad, and not the move towards indigeneity. But that's a conversation for another day. But you have Hugo Blanco, you have the MIR, the Movimiento Izquierdista Revolucionario during the 60s. You have Juan Velasco Alvarado, who worked with many Marxist Leninists for the land reform. Then you have, and you can even go towards you can even move towards the 21st century with Vladimir Cerron, who is the intellectual leader of Peru Libre, the party that's in the presidency right now. If you read his pamphlet for the presidential policy for the presidency, for the government platform, it's very interesting because it does gain a lot of, it both shows a Marxist-Leninist influence in him that does tie back to Mariátegui, a plurinational influence, and an economic one, which I'm tying it all here, to Bolivia. Like, because he was influenced by the economic and cultural and political policies in Bolivia, especially those of Evo Morales, Luis Arce, who's now the president, and others. Why? So what's so? And in Bolivia, you have people like Jesus Lara, who's also a Marxist, who actually debated, who was I think who was a contemporary of Fausto Reynaga. So, and Tristan Marov, who was the one from the 20s. So if and then you have, I forget, Jose Quiroga de Santa Cruz, who was a socialist leader, who was killed during in a coup, in a right wing coup. Now, a lot of these people are actually recognized by Evo in his inaugural speech when he was inaugurated in 2006. Like Quiroga de Santa Cruz, who was that major socialist leader. But you also had other intellectuals like David Choquehuanca or Eusebio Gironda. I'm not sure. Eusebio Gironda. It should be backwards, but you have a lot of these intellectuals that are supporting the MAS and are even part of the MAS government. David Choquehuanca, he's a Quechua who speaks Aymara, who was born in La Paz. So it's very interesting that people confuse it for Aymara. But he writes a lot about Buen Vivir, a lot about the intellectual movement which is similar to Fausto Reynaga in that you need to fuse the Andean spirituality with an anti-capitalist, collectivist relationship between humanity, and then reciprocity between humanity and nature, Yanantin. You have those people working on the more indigenous, Indianist side of Evo Morales, and on the other side you have the more economicist wing of the party, which is like Luis Arce and Garcia Linera, who were both trained economists and sociologists. They were part of the Marxist movements, whereas Choquehuanca was part of the indigenous labor union movement. So you have these two wings that are converging with Evo Morales. Evo Morales himself coming from from the labor movement, the cocaleros, the coca farmers in Cochabamba. But he's also influenced by both of these traditions. He's deeply influenced by the anti-imperialist and Marxist traditions, especially like Che Guevara. But on the other side, he reads people like Fausto Reynaga during the 80s and 90s. He's even tweeted about Fausto Reynaga. There's like one tweet about him, but he shows like he knows who Reynaga is. His government also republished Reynaga's works, especially the complete works, like Las Obras Completas. So it was state-sponsored republication of his text, showing his appreciation for that intellectual history. And I think someone like Evo Morales, in some ways, unified a lot of the disparate leftist and decolonial movements that found a common ground with someone like Evo Morales, who came from multiple backgrounds. But I think the most important part about Evo, I think, is that his presidency created an intellectual culture that is not seen in other countries like Peru or Ecuador, or even across Latin America. Because whereas in Ecuador you have the division between the Conay, the indigenous, and then the Marxists, the Correístas. In Peru you don't have that strong indigenous culture of like, yes, indigenous intellectuals are popping up left and right. You have people like Ciro Galvez, yeah, but not much after that. In Bolivia, in some ways, Evo Morales' presidency consolidated in a uniquely indigenous Bolivian intellectualism that is, in some ways, that is still burgeoning. And what was it? You have intellectuals like Fernando Wanacuni, Mamani, David Choquehuanca talking about Buen Vivir. You have Eusebio Gironda talking about like anti-colonialist defenses of Evo Morales. You have plurinacionalidad. Bolivia in some ways was the first playground for plurinacionalidad, and Evo Morales. And I think the one important thing is that he isn't consolidating it just in Bolivia. He has his organization RUNASUR,
Hmm.
that is trying to spread plurinationalidad across Latin America. So it essentially, Evo Morales is trying to expand indigenous and leftist Latin American culture across Latin America, and I think that shows some of the both the internationalism that he learned, but as well as the intellectualism that he's like, as well as like the conditions that he sees as right to spread plurinationalidad, as well as the the specific leftist economic policies that are being passed, which I would love to get into, but I'm not sure there's much time in about that.